Thanks, Ron, and it's a privilege to be here. I must mention that it's also a bit intimidating because I'm coming from the climate change community, not from the impact assessment community. This talk will cover, it's essentially a stock taking that we had done on the degree of attention paid in different jurisdictions to the need to incorporate climate change risks and adaptation within EIA procedures. It's work that's been done jointly by the OECD DAC, the Development Assistance Committee, and the Environmental Policy Committee, also at the OECD. So in terms of the outline of my talk, it's a long list of items, but I'll go relatively quickly. Why integrate climate change impacts and adaptation in EIA? And probably after a day into this meeting, I think not much more could be said about it. Then I'll just run through the various steps in EIA procedures and identify potential entry points for incorporating climate change information, as well as adaptation measures. And the bulk of my presentation will essentially focus on the stock taking of progress in this direction in different jurisdictions. And then I will discuss some specific country examples at three levels. Countries and agencies which have signaled their intent to include climate change risks within EIA modalities, then countries which have gone a bit further and developed operational guidance, and finally, actual examples at the project level from a relatively small set of countries. And I'll detail one specific example from Australia, and then go to some of my concluding remarks in terms of how much progress has been made, dwell a bit more on scientific uncertainties, although the issue has already come up this morning, and then make some concluding remarks. So in terms of why incorporate climate change impacts and adaptation in EIA, the need to integrate climate change risks and adaptation is now being widely recognized, and it's also being recognized that that needs to be done at all levels, from policy and planning processes down to the project level. The project level obviously remains quite critical, both for development agencies as well as national jurisdictions. And in this context, EIA could certainly be an efficient tool to climate-proof projects because it's already a well-established decision-making tool in many countries, as well as in bilateral and multilateral agencies. And rather than have a separate standalone process for climate change risk screening and integrating adaptation considerations, there's probably some logic to broadening the scope of EIA to include climate change risks and adaptation. But at the same time, there's a key challenge because EIA is designed to identify impacts of a project on the environment and not the impacts of environmental change on the project. This is just the definition coming from the IAIA on EIA and the key goals of an EIA process. I'm not going to go into it because it's pretty basic, I think, for this audience. What I'm going to spend some time on is just going through the various steps in the EIA procedures and discussing a little bit what might be some of the entry points for incorporating climate change information. Now, the first stage here is actually not part of the EIA cycle. This is the more strategic phase where the decision is made with regard to whether there's a need for the project and its justification. And so this could be part of the SEA, for example. And at this stage, as part of this decision-making stage, some key questions that could be addressed could be, does the project scope, for example, its design life, in an investment level, justify considering climate change risks and vulnerability? And again, here, for example, in terms of the design life of the project, obviously, if you have projects which have a much longer design life, then a priori, there's much more need to consider future climate change risks. Another question that could be critical is, could the project potentially be sensitive to climate change? And if so, what would be the broad implications? This is more of a quick screen. It doesn't require very detailed analysis at this stage, but it might be important to at the same time, still think through some of these questions when decisions are made with regard to project need and justification. Then we come to the actual EIA process and the project identification phase. And this is where the relevant authority could spend a bit more time and attention to the questions with regard to what climate variables and aspects of changes in these variables would be relevant for the project, and also establish some guidelines in terms of who could conduct a more detailed climate change risk assessment. And those requirements could then be communicated to the project proponent. The real stage where climate change risks and adaptation measures could be assessed in more detail is the detailed assessment phase of the EIA. And this is where the project proponent would probably need to hire an expert to more systematically look at climatic variables of interest. And then when the EIA goes through public consultation and submission, that's where the relevant authorities would need to decide whether climate risks and adaptation options have been correctly identified and assessed. And also another question, whether the project might have risks for maladaptation. Could it lead to circumstances where there might actually be enhanced vulnerability to the impacts of climate change? And then we come to the implementation phase, and this is where any adaptation measures that have been identified and a decision has been made to implement them, this is where they could be incorporated into project design or operational practices, and so on. Now, in terms of stock taking of progress, there's been a lot of interest in terms of incorporating climate risks within EIA modalities for some time now, over a decade actually, but the degree of progress varies across jurisdictions. And to make sense of it, we've sort of taken a three-level approach. The first level is intentions. Have countries expressed intention to use EIA to climate-proof projects? And is this intention integrated into national planning documents? The second level is operational guidance. Has the regulatory framework been modified to integrate climate change in the EIA process? And are specific operational guidelines in place? And finally, we come to the implementation phase. Is the EIA providing guidance to climate-proof projects? And are there cases where projects have actually systematically taken climate risks and adaptation into account as part of the EIA? In terms of country examples at each of these levels, there are actually quite a few examples where the intent to incorporate climate change considerations has been signaled. And Canada is, among the OECD countries, Canada is probably the oldest example. But there are some new cases also. For example, the EC has reflected its intent to also include climate change considerations, but progress in terms of implementation remains slow. A number of small island developing states have actually talked about incorporating natural hazards management, which is not very different from adaptation to climate variability as part of the EIA. And some of them have also signaled the intent to look at what climate change might do to natural hazards and how to incorporate that information. Then the Caribbean Development Bank and CARICOM have developed specific recommendations for Jamaica, I think in 2004, on how to go about incorporating climate change risks as part of the EIA process. In terms of operational guidance, there are actually two cases we are aware of. The Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency developed guidance, I think in 2002 or 2003, and CARICOM has also developed operational guidance. The Netherlands Commission for Environmental Assessment doesn't have operational guidance, but I think Rob Verheem in his intervention would be talking more in detail about that. In terms of implementation, most of the examples are with regard to projects in Canada and in Australia, and I'll be talking a bit more about some of those examples.